So welcome everybody this evening to our November 5x5, and our theme for this evening is remembering. Not surprising, as we're meeting on Remembrance Day itself. Our format is, well, the best attempt at least, for 5 people to tell their story, having 5 minutes each, and we'll be recording those 5 stories, after which we will have a time of sharing, at which point we will stop the recording so that we feel free to share. I'm not sure remembering is a specifically spiritual practice. We try and sort of have a theme that links to our spiritual practices, but this month as Kairos, we are sharing the important things on people we remember and what we are thankful for. So our stories may take us far and wide, but given the day it is, I'm sure there'll be some connection. And our first story, I'm actually using a recording from a Methodist presbyter, Ian Brown, who I did a placement with when I was in training and later became a chaplain in the UF Force. And he's just got a very short reflection on remembering that we're going to watch together. It's not playing.
Hello, my name is Ian Brown. I'm a Methodist presbyter and a chaplain in the Royal Air Force. Every Remembrance Sunday, I like to ask people what they think about during the 2-minute silence. I've received a range of answers over the years, from images on the TV news, to friends I have lost, to did I remember to lock the front door when we left home, and even, are these tights black or navy? There was a time I used to wonder what to focus on during the silence, but not anymore. About 20 years ago, I visited some of the war grave sites in northern France. I remember being overwhelmed by the sheer scale of loss on display. Row upon row of white headstones, installed with great precision, each one pristinely kept. It spoke to me of sacrifice and the cost of war. At one particular cemetery, left wondering how I ought to respond, I turned to the Book of Remembrance, a book that lists the names and hometowns of each person buried there. To my surprise, I discovered a direct relative, a great uncle from my mother's side of the family. I already knew something of his story, but had never known what became of him. In that moment, I realized that I could channel my remembrance. There was a personal connection. Sadly, these days, I don't need to travel back to 1918 for a personal connection to grief and loss surrounding war and conflict. I have helped say goodbye to many men and women who have died in the service of their country. It is vital that we take time to remember, to honour the fallen, and to commit to caring for the living. So for me, when it's time for the 2-minute silence on Remembrance Day, I think of those who will grow not old, the people known to me whose lives have been devastated by war and conflict, and I pray for peace.
So that's our first sharing from Ian. Our second sharing is from Andrew Wren, a member of my church in Acomb, and he was particularly keen, after having attended the Queen lying in state, to share with our church how that had been, what had happened, and his reflections on it. He gave quite a long input, and I've just taken an extract of that. The sound isn't great, I'm afraid, from the recording. I've done my best. So there's a little bit of a whine in it, but I hope you still can catch what Andrew shares.
So we finally got to the cure. And what we didn't know at the time, which was really lovely to know afterwards, was that many of you were actually watching the live stream that the BBC had, and saw us go in and into this magnificent medieval hall, which looks a lot more impressive when you're there than it did on telly. And we came at the point where there was the tap, tap, tap going of the changing of the guard, so that the soldiers that were protecting the coffin were shifting their positions. Other than that, it was very silent and very dignified. We were in there for a couple of minutes and we paid our respects. But it was lovely that Charlie said afterwards to us, it felt like you were there for all of us. And that to me sums up the importance of the event itself, that it was a moment where the nation, which at the moment we know is very divided in difficult times, actually came together for a short period where it felt as if we were sort of out of time to mark the passing of a great queen. And afterwards, we were very tired, we didn't have anywhere to sleep, we didn't know quite what we were going to do, so we went to Buckingham Palace to look at the floral tributes. And there, what palace staff had done was to take all the floral tributes and place them in piles under the trees of St. James's Park next door. And we were there at 11:15 onwards, so next slide please. So there you can get an idea of how beautiful London looks at night. Next one. And there you can see all the floral tributes under the trees and by candlelight. And I found this more spiritually moving than actually seeing the coffin itself, actually, because what you got was that there was a collective sense of loss. And through the messages and the very touching tributes that had been left, there were people who felt that personal connection with somebody that they had never met. And that not only did they respect her as a monarch, but they also respected her as a spiritual leader. So if we look at some of the photographs that I took, next slide please, you can see here that the motif of her going off into the sunset kind of thing was something that people acknowledged. Next slide please. That there was that well-known picture of her being led off into the distance by Paddington Bear from that very funny sketch at the Platinum Jubilee. And it struck me that Michael Bond must have been very curious about this idea that if he'd been still alive, that Paddington was sort of playing the role of an angel to the Queen, if you like. Next slide, please. And there you can see a quote that you may have seen used quite a lot, which I think is one of the most profound things that she said in her reign, which is that grief is the price we pay for love. And President Biden used that to remind people of the families who suffered from 9/11 recently. It shows the universality of what she stood for, but of course the core with floral corgi as well. Next slide, please. And so just to finish there really with, and I'll give Katie an opportunity just to say what impact it had on hers. What struck me at the time was it reminded me of that speech that she made early on in the pandemic. You may remember that, before vaccines were even on the horizon. She was the only person that could say what she said at that point. She said it from the green room of Windsor Castle, where she first broadcast to the Commonwealth at the age of 13 in 1940. Only she represented that longevity that she could do that. She invoked Vera Lynn, saying, "We'll meet again," and that there was hope for the future. And she used that experience that she had of having seen waves of suffering in national life over the decades in which she served in her role. And yet, in the heart of the pandemic, when there was so much suffering, people felt so powerless. What she observed in that message that she put across to the people was that she saw God's work in the way that so many people pulled together as volunteers to help those who were suffering, putting together food parcels, the army and other and ambulance staff and NHS staff pulling together to serve the people at a point of national crisis. And in that sense, for me, she showed the spiritual leadership for which I think we owe her a huge debt.
Okay, thank Andrew for that reflection. And again, I apologise for the sound on my sad photo story. It's a little bit muddy because I was using the wrong microphone, but again, bear with me. For those of you who like to capture life with your cameras or phones, I want to ask you a simple question. How many photos among all those you've taken are of people crying? I take thousands of photos every year, and I've got thousands of photos of my family, my kids, my friends, even strangers in different places. But looking through them, I've got none of people crying. I've got one of my daughter when she was younger with a very stern face, pouting, giving me a Paddington hard stare. I would show it tonight, but I don't feel it's entirely fair to do so. I know I'd be getting an even more hard Paddington stare if I did. Even if you Google crying, most of the photos of crying you get, I think, are staged. Few, I'm guessing, are captured during real crisis moments. And that one photo of Hannah I have is the nearest I think I've got among 150,000 photos of a really negative emotion. I'm not suggesting that we're forever angry or in tears in my family, but it happens. But there's not much in me that wants to capture that moment. There are, of course, other photos in my collection, that a small number, that are quite neutral, everyday life shots. But I'd hazard a guess that the majority, which I have, are of family, are of us smiling and happy and having fun, which doesn't really represent our normal life either. And yet that one sad picture comes to mind when I started thinking about this idea. I can't remember what caused her upset. In a way, I don't need to, because I actually don't find it that hard to remember other occasions where the tears have flowed, and often it's been my fault they have. The reality, though, is my life exists neither in the joyful celebrations or in the miserable, heart-wrenching lows. I've been tempted a few times when I've encountered that photo to delete it, to extinguish that reminder, but something stopped me. I think because it reminds me, enables me to better value the times in the middle, the ordinary times when life simply happens, the daily rhythms, the everyday simple pleasures of life, the reliefs and the respite, the gentle ups and downs of normality. It's very easy not to value those times. But having the reminder of the lows among the highs helps me to reframe my perspective and give thanks for that middle ground of normal. Today's Remembrance Day, and I think in most years, Remembrance Day for me has been a time to reflect on our shared history, to remember the lost, to grieve with others. But also as a nation and as a world, it's been a reminder we may not be on top of the world at the moment, but the world can and has been a much darker place. But this year hasn't really done that for me. Instead, it's left me with feelings of foreboding as I see the patterns of the past playing out in the geopolitics and realities of our present. And of course, our news, our media, is virtually the polar opposite of my personal photo collection. It's almost entirely a diet of difficult, challenging, fearful, and failing. Occasionally we get this little nugget at the end, don't we, of positivity and human kindness among the generally worrying narrative, which I'm certainly finding at the moment brings its own challenge. There's such a diet of negativity and fear that it's quite hard to bear, and largely as far from actual reality as my photos are. But perhaps because of that, this year Remembrance is leaving me seeking hope and leaning on the stories in Scripture of God's redeeming power in the past more strongly than ever. A call for me then this year has been not so much to celebrate the status quo, but to try and act in some ways, in that we can escape the tidal pull of escalation and decline we seem to be travelling on. I suppose my recollection is in looking for that sad photo to talk about today. I had to scan through thousands of photos of my daughter And in doing so, I trawled through those hundreds and hundreds of happy, smiling, joyful memories that both preceded and followed it. And I was reminded afresh that its sadness, although real, is set in a larger story of our positive relationship, our shared history that is full of love and forgiveness and compassion and grace. In our Seeking Aliveness book recently, we've been reading some passages that the rhythm of the church's set text often avoids: the slaughter of the tribes that were already present in the promised land when the people of God arrived in it. The end of Psalm 137, that the rivers of Babylon that Boney M bring to life for us, and is this lovely uplifting song, and yet the actual end includes the line, "Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." It's actually not great to be reminded of those texts in our Bibles, and it's all too easy to see the patterns of the old repeated in the present. But for me, the same passages remind me of how good the news of Jesus in my life and for them was, of God revealing a loving nature that shines much brighter in contrast to the darkness of people's hearts that I think has shadowed the writers of the Old Testament. Looking for those dark passages also reminded me of that larger story, of the thousands of other stories of God's love for me and for us all. It reminds me that each of us has highs and lows, but there's that bigger story of God's love for this world, for me, for you. And that allows me to reframe the story of God, my story, the hope I have in the future, in the same way as that bad photo, that dark photo, that brooding, upset photo of my daughter does. The world is not going to be forever a dark place. There is a path of light. There is a possibility of goodness that I am called to walk, and that we are promised will lead to a better world. The observant among you will notice I couldn't keep to 5 minutes, but there you go. My apologies. We have a treat now of a live story sharing, so I'm going to stop sharing so that Leanne can.
Okay. So I was thinking about remembering, and how in remembering our own story, it reminds us of who we are and helps us to decide where to go and how we're going to be in the future as well. And we lived with my grandparents when we first moved from the Midlands down to the Thames Valley. I was about 9, and I moved from a very little, very ordinary school in the Neaton down to one where people went riding at the weekend, and I mean horses rather than bikes. And I remember me and my sister Sam walking down the hill after school to meet my grandparents on their allotment. And on the allotment, we would pick baby carrots and we'd rinse them under the garden tap, and then we would eat them, nibbling right the way up to the leafy tops. But we would dread being asked to pick the gooseberries. I remember them being in a cage and being really vicious. Both my grandma and my granddad loved nature. My grandma would always say, if something's been good enough to grow, the least we should do is look after it. I'm really glad that she hasn't seen my track record on houseplants. But I think she'd be quite proud of my kitchen garden this year. Whenever I rang my grandparents, it seemed that Grandad answered the phone. And he always said, "Leanne dear, hello." And that's a memory that can still bring tears, actually, when I remember it. And I can't hear his voice saying it anymore, but I know he did. But it's definitely part of the hummus that nourishes my roots and where I've come from, as was my grandma's Kenwood mixer, beating butter and sugar for the sponge cake. Clearly it was an ingrained memory because maybe it was an event that happened so often. I inherited the Kenwood, And at times in my life, maybe I inherited the prolific cake making. But I'm guessing that my grandma too, like me, had seasons when she baked and seasons when she didn't. But my memory is that she always baked. And I remember when she moved up to Hessel after Grandad died and she was crippled with arthritis. And I used to pop round with the kids after school and she would always have something homemade waiting for them. Last week, my mum reminded me how Grandma would bake a cake over a couple of days because it made her shoulders ache so much. But she wouldn't give in. And there was this one time when Miriam, my daughter, had gone round to bake with Grandma, and I'm guessing Miriam was about 4. And when my mum went to pick Miriam up, my grandma had fallen and was sitting on the floor giving directions to Miriam, who was continuing to bake, seemingly unperturbed. And I can almost hear my grandma saying to her, "Never mind, I'm down here. You just make sure there's an even amount in both cake tins." And I wonder if I'm going to cope with aging as stoically and as well as with so much grit as my grandma did. I remember her being so determined and strong, even though she was frail and so disabled by the end. I have so many memories of my grandma. And if I'm feeling sorry for myself, I have words. Yeah, Yvette Harding's granddaughter. Come on. So I do think I've inherited my grandparents' ideas of community. They often had lodges and they loved helping with community events. And before we lived in Marlow, they were on the community planning for the Marlow Regatta. And they persuaded us for years that the reason the flags were out was because we were visiting. And when my grandma lived up here, she wanted to get out more and meet people. And so I took her along to Open Doors with me in Hull. And she wasn't able to help pack the food parcels and she couldn't help make drinks or fold clothes. So she chose to position herself by the front door and she introduced herself to everybody who walked in and she welcomed them and she showed them where to get a cup of tea. And that's the final memory I wanted to share, really. Definitely something that's in my blood. Community and a good cup of tea.
Thank you, Leanne. We've got Mike to share our final memory, and I'm going to put the screen up because he's given me a picture that he'd like to share with us. See if I can find the right control. So do you want to?
Yeah. Okay. I was intrigued when I saw, share a story that you've inherited. This is a real inheritance story for me. The week following Remembrance Sunday last year, I visited also, like your friend, the First World War battlefields. And I went with a few friends, a really good guy from Somerbridge Methodist Church who has a great military knowledge and archaeology. His knowledge is fantastic. And he kept asking me about my granddad who had served in the First World War. And he agreed that he would take me to areas of the Somme. So I found out the battalion that my granddad had been with, and one of the things was we were able to go to the very area where his battalion were stationed before they were moved forward. I was able to get out of the vehicle and touch the same soil. It was really a real poignant moment for me just to know that I was in the same place. My granddad was one of 4 brothers from the Normanton area in West Yorkshire, one of 4, the only one to survive. And he only survived because he was injured on the battlefield. He took a bullet that just perished. One lung went straight through him, and he only survived because the stretcher bearers got him off the battlefield. what I didn't know was that there was another younger brother. And during our visit, my older brother told me about this, and so we went to find the cemetery of his grave, and this is it. It's the gravestone of the youngest brother for Private Charles Poole. And I also have a newspaper cutting announcing his death and of a visit by his sister to the hospital just 2 weeks prior to his death. And it spoke of him being injured in action, having one arm amputated and the other arm just shot to pieces. He died. It also says in that paper cutting that there were three other brothers, and the last of which is my grandfather. I never remember my parents telling us about this story about Private Charles Poole. But when I got to the gravestone, I noticed this inscription on the bottom there. And if you could see there, right at the bottom, it says, "So sad, so sudden was the call. Sweet remembrance outlasts all." It just stayed with me. And when I got back home, I thought, that's got to be from either a poem or a song. And I Googled it just to find if it was from something, and I couldn't find anything. So naturally, I thought, well, this is too big just to leave alone. And so this became the chorus of a song that I wrote for him. And it was my intention to share it in a remembrance service, and that's exactly what me and my older brother will do in Rothwell this coming Sunday. So it's something I was inspired to do. How does it connect with my theology? Well, I believe in the God who forgets no one and goes out to find, the least, the lost sheep. And I just wondered about, my granddad's brother, young Charles, 17 when he signed up, and 19 when he was killed. And what kind of a life he would have had? How many children he would have born, and where we would have been now. So this song became something for me as a remembering him and the many others. So Andy, if you got the song to share, you can do.
Okie doke.
So sad, so sudden was the call. Sweet remembrance outlasts all. No son of mine will be forgot wherever he falls. Sweet remembrance outlasts all. Sentry-like I watched you from our doorstep. Father's pride, the street waved you away. Pals together marching to the station, sure to be back home for Christmas Day. Sweet remembrance, sweet remembrance, sweet remembrance outlasts all. 4 young sons who'd made the house seem smaller, left to give your all for Marshall Haig. Your letters told a very different story, and the leaded type compounded our dismay. Youthfulness exchanged for battle dress, so sad, so sudden was the call. No son of mine will be forgot wherever he falls. falls. Sweet remembrance outlasts all. Sweet remembrance, sweet remembrance, sweet remembrance outlasts all. Dreams of glory snatched from generations. 3 young sons are gone and 1 survived. These few words now chiseled on a headstone. Your dad's intent to keep your name alive. So sad, so sudden was the call. Sweet remembrance outlasts all. No son of mine will be forgot wherever he falls. Sweet remembrance outlasts all. Perhaps there'll be a moment for a pilgrim, bearing of your name and of your kind. And maybe there's a song of sweet remembrance to honor my brave son throughout all time. So sad, so sudden was the call. Sweet remembrance outlasts all. No son of mine will be forgot wherever he falls. Sweet remembrance outlasts all. Sweet remembrance, sweet remembrance, sweet remembrance outlasts all. Sweet remembrance, sweet remembrance, sweet remembrance outlasts all.
Thank you to our 5 contributors. We'll be shortly stopping the recording and moving into a time to share discussion, reflect on what we've heard. Our next gathering is on the 9th of December. We might have a chat around the time, but at the moment set for 6:30 p.m. And as we go into Advent, we're thinking about waiting of all kinds.